Imagine you are the captain of a ship, right?
Yeah.
You're hundreds of miles offshore.
And the weather is just completely turning against you.
Exactly. You are steering straight into this massive, unavoidable storm. I mean, the sky has gone totally black.
The waves are cresting higher than the deck. It's bad.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And your crew is just exhausted. They're running on fumes, and they're looking to you for a decision.
Yeah.
And you basically have two options. And, well, both of them are absolutely terrifying.
Right. Option one is you just follow the stars.
Yes. You stick to your original coordinates. You refuse to alter your perfectly charted course, maintain the absolute integrity of your mission.
But the problem is, the storm is violently real.
Exactly. If you force the ship through the center of that squall just to prove you won't compromise, the hull might breach. You preserve the meaning of the voyage, but you might literally sink the ship and drown everyone.
Which leaves you with option two. You follow the storm, you abandon your charted coordinates, and you steer entirely based on the immediate waves. You dodge the breakers, you turn the ship to reduce the impact.
You're just seeking whatever temporary safe harbor you can find.
Exactly. And you save the ship. You keep the crew alive. But when the sky finally clears, you look around and realize you have drifted hundreds of miles off course.
You're in completely unfamiliar waters.
Heading in a direction you never intended, right? Because you made a dozen little navigational compromises that just completely altered the fundamental purpose of the journey. I mean, you saved the crew, but you lost your identity.
Wow. Yeah. Welcome to the deep dive. We are so thrilled you are joining us today. Because that ship, that storm and that agonizing choice is something every single one of you listening has wrestled with.
Absolutely everyone.
Whether you're leading a massive corporation, managing a small team, raising a family, or just trying to navigate your own career without losing your mind, you have faced the captain's dilemma.
It's universal.
It really is. So our mission today is to unpack this intensely detailed reflection document. It's titled Bannock, Idealism versus Pragmatism. And it is just this profound exploration of that universal human struggle. The tension between doing what is pure and doing what actually works.
Right. It really is the defining tension of human leadership. And what makes this specific framework so vital, I think, is that it completely rejects the sterile academic way we usually talk about decision-making.
Yeah, the whole input data, output perfect solution myth.
Yeah, exactly. We love to pretend that choices are clean mathematical equations, that if you just gather enough data, the correct path will just naturally illuminate itself.
But it never does.
Never. And the Bannock framework forces us to confront the messiness of reality. It just drops this core paradox right in our laps. It says, if you only follow ideals, people suffer. If you abandon them, something inside you dies.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that paradox is the absolute epicenter of the agony, right?
Yeah.
If you only follow ideals, people suffer. If you abandon them, something inside you dies.
It's heavy.
It's so heavy. We're talking about the collision between the soul and the traction. Bannock uses these two massive opposing forces to map out how we operate in the world. So let's start with the soul. Idealism.
Right.
Idealism is this insistence that justice matters. It's the belief that people are more than just, line items on a spreadsheet, and that the world can and must be better than its current baseline.
And the author uses a phrase here that I think completely redefines the concept. They argue that idealism exists to prevent us from becoming spiritually domesticated.
Spiritually domesticated. Man, that is such a heavy concept.
It really is. It forces you to look at how compromise actually functions over time. I mean, domestication isn't something that happens overnight, right?
Right. A wild animal doesn't just walk into a cage and close the door.
Exactly. It happens slowly. It happens by accepting a series of small, pragmatic conveniences until the wildness is just gone. In human terms, spiritual domestication is this slow, creeping acceptance of the way things are as the way things must be. You look at a broken healthcare system or rampant inequality or a toxic corporate culture, and instead of feeling outraged, you just shrug and say,
well, that's just the reality of the market.
Right. Idealism is the absolute refusal to shrug. It's the North Star. People cling to idealism because they are terrified of moral decay. They want their actions to mean something.
Because without that North Star, leadership is just traffic control.
That's a great way to put it.
You're just standing in an intersection, keeping the cars moving so they don't crash into each other. But you have no underlying philosophy regarding where any of those cars are actually going.
You are just maintaining the flow of traffic.
Right. But on the exact opposite side of that intersection, we have pragmatism. If idealism gives you a soul, Pragmatism gives you traction.
Yes.
The pragmatist in the room is the one pointing out the uncomfortable physics of reality. They're saying, look, your good intentions are not the same thing as good outcomes.
The budget is finite. The timeline is fixed.
Exactly. Human nature is flawed. Pragmatism demands that leaders take responsibility
Right.
for the actual lived consequences of their actions, not just the purity of their intentions.
And what's interesting is the underlying fear changes completely. Idealists fear moral decay, right? But pragmatists fear preventable harm.
Preventable harm.
Yeah. They're the ones who have to clean up the mess when beautiful, soaring rhetoric collides with scarce resources. They've seen idealists promise the moon, fail to deliver, and leave vulnerable people worse off than before.
And it's crucial to understand that pragmatism isn't just some modern corporate buzzword, right? It has deep philosophical roots.
Oh, absolutely. Thinkers like Charles Sanders Peirce, William James, and John Dewey, they built philosophical pragmatism as a direct revolt against the idea that truth could exist in a vacuum.
Right. They looked at all those grand, abstract European philosophies and essentially said, who cares?
Pretty much. They were like, it doesn't matter how mathematically elegant your theory is if it fails to work in the mud and dirt of human experience. They wanted to anchor the concept of truth in adaptation and real-world results.
If an idea doesn't help an organism adapt and survive in its environment, it isn't practically true.
Exactly.
But let me ask the question that always comes up when we talk about this adaptation. Isn't pragmatism often just a fancy, socially acceptable word for selling out?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right. I mean, let's take it out of the realm of high philosophy and look at a really grounded scenario. Think about buying a house.
Okay.
You have a vision of the absolute dream home. It's got the wraparound porch. It's in a neighborhood with a great school district. It has a massive backyard for the kids. That is your idealism. That is the pure vision.
The North Star.
Exactly. But then you sit down with a mortgage broker,
Yeah.
right? You look at your actual bank account,
Right.
and your budget is exactly half of what that dream house costs.
Always the case.
Always. So that's the pragmatic reality. So when you eventually compromise, when you buy a much smaller house with no porch in a mediocre neighborhood,
Yep.
are you betraying your soul? Are you being corrupt? Or are you just doing the math?
Yeah.
Is pragmatism just the realization that you literally cannot afford your morals?
That is the exact friction point Bannock targets.
Yeah.
Are you compromising your soul or are you just doing the math? And the framework answers this by forcing us to look at the hidden costs of both extremes when they go unchecked.
Okay.
Let's use your house analogy. What happens if you absolutely refuse to compromise your idealism? You decide that you must have the wraparound porch and the perfect school district. The hidden cost of unchecked idealism is that it becomes, in Bannock's terms, morally elegant but socially reckless.
Morally elegant but socially reckless.
Right. Because you refuse to settle, so maybe you take out a predatory loan you really can't afford, you bankrupt your family, or worse, you refuse to buy anything at all because nothing meets your pure standard and your family ends up homeless or moving from couch to couch.
You've maintained your pure vision of what a home should be.
But you sacrificed the present physical well-being of your family to protect that vision. Unchecked idealism goes toxic when it stops asking the vital question, who is paying the price while we wait for perfection?
The family pays the price for the parents' refusal to bend.
Precisely. But now flip the scenario. What is the hidden cost of unchecked pragmatism? Bannock calls it efficient betrayal.
Efficient betrayal.
Yeah. If you only ever do the cold, hard math, you might look at the housing market and say, well, the most financially efficient move is to buy this incredibly cheap property right next to an industrial chemical plant.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The math works perfectly. The budget is balanced, but you are moving your family into a toxic environment. You're making them miserable, perhaps even physically sick every single day. Unchecked pragmatism treats systemic injustice or a toxic environment as mere background noise.
It normalizes temporary, unacceptable conditions until they become permanent rules.
Exactly. It turns leaders into managers of decline.
Managers of decline. I want to pause on that phrase because it explains so much of what feels wrong in modern institutions.
It really does.
Think about a middle school principal who has just given up on actually educating kids. They realize the budget is slashed, the teachers are burned out, the district mandates are impossible. Instead of fighting for the ideal of education, they just become a manager of decline.
Right. Their only goal is to make sure no one sues the school.
Yes. The attendance numbers look passable on paper, and the fire alarms work. They are efficiently, quietly piloting the ship downward.
And they will justify it by saying, look, I am being realistic. I am keeping the doors open. which is technically true, but the soul of the school is entirely dead. Unchecked pragmatism fails because it stops asking, what are we becoming by accepting this?
Right. And this brings us to why this tension actually hurts so much. We can debate the philosophy all day, but the reason people lose sleep over this is because of the psychological burden it places on you, the individual. The framework dives deep into the internal mechanics of this struggle through the captain's dilemma.
Right. Bannock approaches this not just as a sociological phenomenon, but as an internal psychological war.
Yeah.
The framework identifies two distinct subpersonalities or drives within the human psyche that basically battle for control during a crisis. First, you have the protector energy.
Okay.
In the document's terminology, this is the Devon, Kenny, or Val archetype. This part of your brain is hyper-focused on consequence mitigation. It's obsessed with reducing immediate suffering.
It looks around and says, people are hurting right now. The ship is taking on water right now.
Exactly. What do we do in the next 5 minutes to survive? It carries the heavy, unglamorous responsibility of just keeping the organism alive.
But right alongside it, you have the meaning maker energy.
Yes.
The Tira, Kelly, or Bannock archetype from the text. This is the part of your psyche that thinks entirely in principles and long-term identity.
Yeah.
It isn't looking at the water on the deck. It is looking at the horizon.
Right. It's terrified of that moral decay we talked about earlier.
It exists to screen, if we do this to survive, we won't be the same people tomorrow. The survival isn't worth the cost to our identity.
What's fascinating here is that Bannock's analysis is so penetrating because of the realization that when you are caught in the captain's dilemma, you aren't actually making a philosophical choice between ideals and pragmatism.
It's not.
No. You are making a highly subjective damage assessment. You are choosing which specific type of damage you are willing to inflict and which type you are willing to personally answer for.
Oh, wow. You were literally just picking your poison.
Exactly. Are you willing to accept external harm? Meaning, you hold to your ideals, but people suffer in the physical world because you didn't account for reality. The ship crashes, the crew gets hurt, the company goes bankrupt.
Right.
Or are you willing to accept internal harm? Meaning, you compromise, you save the ship, the crew survives, but you inflict a deep psychological wound on yourself because you betrayed your own core beliefs. It's the agonizing choice between short-term suffering in the real world versus long-term corruption in the soul.
I really want you, the listener, to map this onto your own life. Because have you ever stayed in a toxic job?
Oh, I think we all have.
Yeah. Maybe you worked for a boss who was deeply unethical, or a company whose product you fundamentally didn't believe in, but it paid the bills. It provided health insurance for your family.
That is pure protector energy.
Exactly. That is pragmatism.
Yeah.
You are mitigating the short-term suffering of unemployment, eviction, or medical debt. You are surviving. But what is the cost?
The internal cost.
Yes. Every single morning when you swipe your badge to get into that building, you feel a tiny fracture in your identity. You feel the meaning maker inside you, quietly screaming. You're experiencing that internal harm.
You're slowly corrupting your own sense of self-worth to secure your physical safety.
That is the captain's dilemma playing out in a cubicle. And it is just exhausting.
It's a profound psychic weight. And the truly terrifying nature of this dynamic is that it doesn't stay confined to our individual cubicles or our private minds. When you scale that exact same psychological fracture up to the level of millions of people, you get history. You get the rise and fall of nations. The friction between the protector and the meaning maker dictates how societies evolve, how revolutions succeed or fail, and how laws are written.
Let's look at how this collision actually plays out in the real world then. Let's scale it up. The Bannock framework provides several granular historical case studies, and the mechanics of these events are fascinating when viewed through this lens. Take the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964.
A perfect example.
We usually are taught this as a straight line of moral progress, right? Good defeated bad.
Right.
But the actual mechanics of how it happened relied entirely on the violent friction between idealism and pragmatism.
The civil rights movement is perhaps the ultimate masterclass in why these two forces absolutely require each other to alter a deeply entrenched system. Think about the pure idealism first. The sit-ins, the freedom rides, the March on Washington.
Pure moral fire.
Exactly. It was the uncompromising insistence that segregation was a moral abomination and that human dignity could not wait for a convenient time. If those idealists had listened to the pragmatic moderates of the era who kept telling them to go slow and wait for the system to adjust.
Aggregation would have endured for decades longer.
Absolutely. The system, left to its own pragmatic devices, will always choose the inertia of the status quo. The idealists provided the undeniable moral outrage that forced the issue onto the national stage.
But, and this is where the history gets really gritty, moral outrage, no matter how justified, does not draft legislation.
No, it does not.
A march does not whip votes in the Senate.
Exactly. To turn that soaring moral vision into durable, enforceable law, you needed the brutal, unglamorous pragmatism of operators like Lyndon B. Johnson. The actual passing of the Civil Rights Act required intense institutional maneuvering.
Backroom deals.
Backroom deals, trading political favors, massaging the egos of reluctant senators, and making deeply uncomfortable compromises on the legislative language just to break the filibuster.
If you only had the idealists, the moral fire would have burned bright, but it never would have become the structural concrete of the law.
The system would have just waited for the marchers to go home and then gone back to business as usual.
Exactly. But if you only had the pragmatic operators like LBJ, there never would have been enough external heat to force them to take the political risk in the first place. LBJ needed Martin Luther King Jr.'s moral fire to create the political capital he spent in the Senate. They were paired survival functions for the movement.
We see a different application of this during the 1930s with FDR's New Deal.
Oh yeah, that's a great one.
We often look back at the New Deal, Social Security, the WPA, massive government intervention, as this grand ideological triumph of progressive idealism. But Bannock frames it quite differently. The New Deal was actually an exercise in massive emergency pragmatism.
It wasn't about imposing a pure progressive utopia. It was about stopping the ship from sinking.
Precisely. During the Great Depression, you had millions starving, banks collapsing, and a very real threat of violent revolution or totalitarianism sweeping the country as it was in Europe.
Okay.
The New Deal wasn't a pristine ideological rollout. It was messy. They were throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. It was a protector energy at a national scale. People are starving right now. The economy is bleeding out right now. We must intervene immediately, abandon the old rules of limited government, and try anything to stabilize the ship.
It was a pragmatic intervention to reduce immediate suffering, rather than a rigid adherence to any one economic philosophy.
Exactly.
The framework also scales this up to the global stage, contrasting two massive modern endeavors: the UN's Sustainable Development Goals and China's economic pivot under Deng Xiaoping. Let's look at the UN SDGs first. This is the definition of what the text calls planetary idealism.
The SDGs are an incredibly beautiful North Star. 17 goals to end poverty, achieve gender equality, protect the oceans, and ensure sustainable energy for everyone on Earth by 2030. It is a breathtaking moral vision. But when you look at the mechanics of implementation, you see the glaring weakness of idealism detached from pragmatic capacity. The goals vastly outpace the actual political realities, the supply chains, the financing mechanisms, and the state capacity of the nations tasked with achieving them.
You can decree that the world must run on clean energy, but if a developing nation literally doesn't have the electrical grid or the capital to build solar farms, the ideal just floats in the air.
It becomes aspirational poetry rather than policy. The ship has a beautiful destination, but no engine and no food in the galley.
And then you have the inverse. Deng Xiaoping taking control of China in the late 1970s. The country had just been devastated by the Cultural Revolution, which was a period of absolute, terrifying, unchecked ideological purity.
Right. Mao demanded pure communist idealism, and the result was the starvation and death of millions.
Millions. So Deng Xiaoping steps in and executes a massive pragmatic pivot. His famous quote embodies this perfectly. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice.
That is the ultimate pragmatist manifesto. Deng moved the country away from strict ideology and introduced market-oriented reforms, foreign investment, and private enterprise.
And the result was arguably the greatest poverty alleviation event in human history. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of grinding poverty. The material traction was unprecedented.
But Bannock rightly points out that this is where the captain's dilemma gets incredibly dark. What was the cost of that pragmatic pivot?
The moral and political costs were staggering.
Yes. The Chinese state maintained iron-fisted authoritarian control. Human rights, political dissent, freedom of expression, all of these ideals were brutally suppressed in the name of economic stability and pragmatic growth. It is the ultimate trade-off. Massive material traction, but at a profound ongoing moral cost. They caught the mice, but the nature of the system became deeply oppressive.
Okay, but let me throw a wrench into this. We keep looking at situations where a balance is required, but what if a movement is just fundamentally 100% morally correct?
Like what?
Let's say you have an uprising against a literal, brutal, oppressive dictatorial regime. People are fighting for their basic right to exist. In that scenario, can the movement still fail just because it lacks pragmatism? Does moral fire ever just win on its own merit? Because the universe bends toward justice.
It is a deeply hopeful question, and the historical record gives us a very sobering answer. No.
No.
The stars do not fix the ship. Bannock addresses this specifically when looking at the physics of revolutionary politics. Uprisings almost always begin as pure idealist reactions to humiliation and injustice, and they are completely justified in their moral outrage. The dictator must fall.
Right.
But if that revolutionary movement treats practical governance as an afterthought, if they believe their moral purity is all they need, they inevitably collapse.
Because the day after the dictator flees, someone still has to turn the water on.
Exactly. Moral fire is an ignition source. It is not a governing system. You cannot run a municipal power grid with moral outrage. You cannot manage a complex agricultural supply chain with revolutionary slogans.
That makes a lot of sense.
When idealists overthrow a system but fail to quickly transition into the unglamorous pragmatism of administration, logistics, and compromise, the vacuum is filled by chaos. And what happens when there is chaos and scarcity? The people demand order. And that is when the revolution usually produces a new wave of coercion, violent backlash, or a new dictator. The failure wasn't in their ideals. The ideals were just. The failure was the refusal to acknowledge the physical constraints of reality.
Moral fire is an ignition source, not a governing system. That is the reality check. So we can look at history and see this dynamic clearly. But what I love about how Bannock approaches this is that it doesn't just leave it in the past. It applies this exact framework to our modern political landscape.
Yes, and it does it so well.
And I need to state this very clearly for you listening. It does so by completely stripping away the partisanship. It doesn't take a side.
Yeah.
We are absolutely not endorsing any political viewpoints, parties, or ideologies here.
Right. This is strictly an academic exercise analyzing the framework presented in the source material. We're just popping the hood on the Democrats and the Republicans to see how this tension between the soul and traction is currently operating.
Exactly. This nonpartisan diagnostic approach is so refreshing because it allows us to look at the mechanics of our current polarization without getting defensive. So let's look at how Bannock characterizes the general tendencies of the Democratic Party. The framework suggests that Democrats typically lean toward idealism in their moral framing, but pragmatism in their policy design.
Which is a really interesting combination.
Let's break that down. What does idealist moral framing actually look like in practice?
It means their starting point is a grand vision of what should be. The rhetoric is sweeping and morally absolute. For instance, the framing that healthcare is a fundamental human right, or that we must completely transition to a green economy to save the planet, or that higher education should be debt-free.
Big goals.
Right. These are massive idealist North Stars. They are arguing for a fundamental restructuring of society based on moral imperatives.
But then they have to actually govern, and that is where their pragmatism kicks in.
Exactly. And often it is a very messy pragmatism because they are trying to implement these massive idealist visions within a deeply constrained, capitalistic, slow-moving system.
Like pushing a boulder uphill.
Yeah. So the healthcare as a human right ideal gets translated into the Affordable Care Act, a massively complex, thousands of pages long bill built on tax credits, phased rollouts, state-by-state compromises, and private insurance mandates.
Right.
Bannock points out that at their worst, this specific combination leads to immense public frustration. The party promises a soaring moral vision, but the actual delivery is slow, bureaucratically agonizing, and full of half measures.
They sell you the stars, but then they hand you a 400-page manual on how to calculate your celestial navigation tax credits.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, let's flip the lens. How does Bannock analyze the Republicans? It suggests they operate on the exact inverse. They lean toward pragmatism in their view of constraints, but idealism in their core principles.
The conservative starting point is deeply pragmatic regarding human nature and systemic limits. They tend to look at the world and say, resources are finite, human beings respond to economic incentives, not just moral pleas. Massive top-down government engineering usually fails or produces unintended consequences.
So they focus on what historically works within the limits of reality.
Yes, which usually means relying on free markets, localized control, and incremental change.
But their ideals are just as fierce. They are just aimed at different targets.
Yes. Their idealism is fiercely attached to principles like individual liberty, constitutional tradition, and national sovereignty. They hold these as non-negotiable.
Oh.
But Bannock identifies the specific failure mode for this combination as well. At their worst, this tendency to prioritize stability, market forces, and tradition over systemic change can create a blind spot to actual suffering.
Wow.
It allows profound systemic injustices or market failures to persist simply because that is just how the system works, and disrupting it would be worse. They protect the ship so well that they ignore the people drowning in the water.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The common media narrative is always that one side is the naive dreamers and the other side is the cold realists.
Always.
But Bannock argues that both sides are actually both. They just apply their idealism and their pragmatism to different phases of the problem.
Yeah.
The real divide in modern politics is not a battle between idealists and pragmatists. It is a battle over two entirely different questions. What is worth idealizing versus what constraints must we respect?
That is the root of the fracture. It's not lack of ideals, it is misaligned ideals. But beneath that fracture, Bannock highlights something that actually offers a strange kind of hope.
Hope?
Yeah. If you dig past the partisan venom, both sides actually share the exact same foundational values.
Wait, really?
Yes. They both desperately want freedom, they both want security, they both want prosperity, and crucially, in the modern era, they both deeply distrust massive, centralized systems.
So if they want the exact same things, why do they hate each other so much?
Because they possess entirely different threat models for what endangers those values. The way you define the threat dictates the pragmatic action you take.
Let's dig into that, because the mechanics of these threat models explain practically every argument we have. Let's take freedom. Both sides value freedom. But Bannock shows how the left generally views freedom as freedom from hardship.
Right.
The primary threat to your freedom is poverty, lack of medical care, or systemic discrimination. If you are working 3 jobs and can't afford insulin, you are not free.
Exactly.
Therefore, the pragmatic solution is strong government intervention and social safety nets to remove that hardship.
Meanwhile, the right generally views freedom as freedom from control. The primary threat to your freedom is government overreach, heavy taxation, and bureaucratic mandates dictating your life and business. If the state can tell you what to do, what to buy, and how to operate, you are not free.
So the pragmatic solution is deregulation, lower taxes, and restricting state power.
It is the exact same word freedom, but the differing threat models make their pragmatic solutions completely incompatible.
The same mechanism applies to security. One side sees the threat to security as global instability, climate change, and poverty. So the pragmatic solution is global cooperation, international treaties, and foreign aid.
Right.
The other side sees the threat to security as external state actors, porous borders, and loss of sovereignty. So the pragmatic solution is a dominant military, strict border enforcement, and energy independence. They both want to keep the ship safe, but they are looking at completely different radar screens.
And when you layer this fundamental misalignment of threat models over our modern technological environment, the polarization becomes nuclear.
Oh, absolutely.
Bannock points out that we are no longer just disagreeing on the best method to solve a shared problem. We are living in fractured information ecosystems. The algorithms feed us entirely different realities with different obvious truths.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the systemic incentives of our politics and our media actively reward rigidity. If a politician actually tries to engage in healthy pragmatism, if they cross the aisle to make a compromise that moves the needle slightly, their own ecosystem instantly brands them as a traitor.
Compromise is basically a dirty word now.
In a hyperpolarized world, pragmatism doesn't look like wisdom. It looks like moral surrender.
It's as if the entire system is designed to trigger that agonizing internal captain's dilemma we talked about, but publicly. And this tension doesn't just stay in the halls of Congress. It fractures across every single granular dimension of how we view society and how we interact with each other.
It does.
Bannock maps out 9 distinct dimensions of this tension. I want us to really explore a few of these because this is where the grand philosophy hits the pavement of our daily lives.
These dimensions are incredibly useful tools for diagnosing the root cause of almost any societal argument. You realize people aren't arguing about the specific policy. They are arguing over which fundamental survival function takes priority.
Let's look at the tension between the individual and the collective. This plays out in boardrooms, in schools, in public health.
Right. The idealist argument here usually champions the inherent, untouchable dignity of the individual. You cannot sacrifice the rights of one person for the convenience of the group. Or, conversely, it champions the pure collective ideal. We all rise and fall together and no one should be left behind.
Okay.
The pragmatist, however, is looking at the brutal math of coordination. They are saying, if we cater to every individual's specific needs and rights, the system gridlocks and society collapses. We need standardized rules, mass coordination, and sometimes the individual must be inconvenienced for the system to remain viable.
We saw this play out intensely during the pandemic. The ideal of individual bodily autonomy versus the pragmatic need for collective public health coordination. What about the dimension of security versus privacy? We all argue about this every time we download an app or go through an airport.
This is a classic Bannock tension. The idealist says, privacy is a fundamental human right. The state or the corporation has no business monitoring my communications, my location, or my data. It is a beautiful moral stance, but the pragmatist says, we live in a world with real threats: terrorism, human trafficking, massive cyber attacks. Total privacy provides a dark room for bad actors to operate. If you want the security that allows society to function, you have to surrender some degree of privacy so we can see the threats coming.
And the tension between stability and change, this might be the most common argument in any corporate office.
Absolutely. The idealist comes in and says, our current processes are outdated, they are unfair, they are inefficient. We need to disrupt everything, implement new software, change the hierarchy, and adapt to the future. They want progress.
Right. And the pragmatist.
The pragmatist, the veteran middle manager, looks at them and says, if you change too many variables at once, you will break the fragile systems that are currently keeping the lights on. Rapid change causes chaos. But the idealist shoots back. If we prioritize stability forever, we will stagnate and become irrelevant.
Let's pull out one more. Regulation versus the free market.
The idealist looks at the market and sees exploitation. They see corporations prioritizing profit over the environment, over worker safety, over consumer health. Their ideal is protection. We must regulate the market to ensure fairness and safety.
Which makes total sense.
It does, but the pragmatist acknowledges the flaws but points out the economic physics. Heavy regulation suffocates the dynamism, the risk-taking, and the innovation that actually creates wealth in the first place. If you regulate the market until it is perfectly safe, it stops producing the resources we need to survive.
As we walk through these dimensions, and there are others, like globalism versus nationalism, equality versus merit, there's a profound unifying pattern that Bannock identifies across all of them. What is the through line connecting all these arguments?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, across every single dimension, idealism is always defining what matters. It is setting the moral priority and the ultimate destination.
And pragmatism.
Pragmatism is always determining what is survivable. It is testing the functional viability of the system in the present moment. And the deep paradigm-shifting insight of the framework is that these are not enemies. They are paired survival functions. You literally cannot have one without the other.
Let me throw an analogy at you to see if it captures the mechanics of this paired survival function.
Okay, I love analogies.
Think about tuning a guitar. You have this perfect, pure pitch that you want the string to hit. That pure note is your idealism, is what you are striving for. But the guitar string itself is a physical object made of steel or nylon. It is anchored to wood. It has actual physical tension limit.
No.
That physical limit is your pragmatism. Now, if you are an unchecked idealist, you only care about hitting the perfect pitch. You ignore the physical limits of the string. You crank the tuning peg higher and higher. What happens?
The string snaps.
The string snaps. The system breaks. You get no music.
The tension destroys the system.
Right. But what if you are an unchecked pragmatist? You are so terrified of snapping the string, you are so obsessed with preserving the system and avoiding any stress, that you leave the string totally loose. What happens when you pluck it?
You just get a dull, vibrating thud.
There is no music. It is total stagnation.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. The music only exists in the tension between the ideal pitch and the physical constraint. The tension isn't a mistake in the design of the guitar. The tension is the exact mechanism that creates the art.
You need the string to be pulled tight by the ideal while being held firmly by the pragmatic reality of the wood, which leads us to the climax of the Bannock document. If these forces are paired survival functions, if we need the tension of the guitar string, how do we actually tune it? How do we balance these forces in our daily lives and our leadership? Because Bannock drops a massive reality check here that completely upends how most of us think about compromise.
Right. Because when most of us hear the word balance, our brains automatically default to a 50-50 split.
We think, okay, to be a good leader, I need to be half idealist and half pragmatist. I will just compromise right down the middle on everything.
But the text explicitly states that this is the biggest trap you can fall into. Aiming for a 50-50 split does not create balance. It just produces indecision. You end up being wishy-washy, you stand for nothing, and yet you still execute poorly.
So what's the solution?
The Bannock synthesis, the true optimal balance defined in the framework, is much more demanding than just splitting the difference. It argues that you must be 100% idealist in your direction and 100% pragmatist in your execution.
100% in both.
Yeah.
How is that practically possible without tearing yourself apart?
It is possible through a very specific rule the author lays out. It is the core thesis of the entire document. Never compromise your values quietly. Only compromise your methods consciously.
Never compromise your values quietly. Only compromise your methods consciously.
Let's break down the mechanics of that rule. Your values, your North Star, that is your direction. You must hold that at 100%. You never pretend that your ideal has changed just because the current reality makes it hard to reach.
You don't lower your standards to make yourself feel better about failing.
Exactly. But your methods, your execution, that is your pragmatism. You hold that at 100% as well. You accept that the path to get to the ideal will be messy, indirect, and require deeply uncomfortable trade-offs. You compromise on the how, but you never surrender the why.
To help us navigate this, the text makes a really sharp distinction between different types of pragmatism and idealism. It contrasts healthy pragmatism with defensive pragmatism. What is the difference in how they function?
Healthy pragmatism looks at a broken, constrained reality and asks, given this mess, what is the absolute best move we can make right now to get one step closer to the good? It acknowledges the constraints, but it is still actively pulling toward the ideal.
It's the guitar string holding tensions.
Exactly. Defensive pragmatism is toxic. It looks at the mess and says, well, this is just how things are. We can't change it, so why try? It uses the reality of constraints as a convenient excuse to avoid the hard, painful work of moral effort. It is the loose guitar string.
And the text makes a similar distinction on the other side, contrasting true idealism with ego-driven idealism.
Yeah.
I found this part incredibly convicting, especially in the age of social media.
It is a vital distinction. True idealism carries the heavy, terrifying responsibility for the actual consequences of the vision. If a true idealist demands a massive change to a system, they stay around to own the fallout, manage the transition, and care for the people displaced by the change.
And ego-driven idealism.
Ego-driven idealism, or what we might call aesthetic idealism, doesn't actually care about the outcome. It only cares about the performance. It is the desire to feel right, to look pure to your peer group, to have the most righteous social media post. An ego-driven idealist doesn't care if the ship crashes and the crew drowns, as long as everyone knows the captain was yelling the morally superior coordinates as it went down.
Wow.
Yeah.
It is pure performance. The text also adds a temporal layer to this synthesis, arguing that the optimal balance actually shifts depending on the life cycle of a problem.
Yes, timing is everything. If you are in the very early stages of a movement, a startup, or a crisis, you need pure idealism. You need the visionary to stand up and say, we are going to do the impossible.
Yeah.
You need that ignition source.
Right.
But once the project moves into the mid-stage, the actual building of the solution, you desperately need pragmatism. You have to stop giving speeches and start writing code, drafting bylaws, managing supply chains, and dealing with HR complaints.
The glamorous stuff.
Exactly. But eventually, any mature system reaches a late-stage stagnation where it becomes obsessed with self-preservation and forgets its original purpose. At that point, you need a massive surge of idealism again to disrupt the inertia and course correct. A lot of our societal conflicts happen simply because people are operating in different time horizons, shouting past each other.
So, practically speaking, let's put this into action. When you are standing in the storm, facing the captain's dilemma, how do you actually make the call?
Okay.
The Bannock model gives us 4 highly practical questions for decision-making. 4 coordinates on a compass. Let's role-play this to see how it works.
I love that. Let's do it.
Let's say you are the CEO of a mid-sized green energy startup. Your mission is to revolutionize solar tech. But the market is tanked, supply chains are broken, and you are 3 months away from total bankruptcy.
Not a good spot to be in.
Not at all. The Protector Energy says lay off 40% of the staff, buy cheaper toxic materials from an unethical supplier, and survive. The Meaning Maker says If we use toxic materials, we betray our entire reason for existing. We should just fold the company with our integrity intact. You are in the storm. How do you use the compass?
Let's run the 4 questions. Question 1 is the North Star. What is the ideal we absolutely refuse to lose? If we lose this, the company's soul dies.
As the CEO, I'd say our North Star is that our core technology must remain 100% clean. We cannot pivot to building fossil fuel components just to make a quick buck, or we lose our identity entirely.
Okay, that holds the 100% idealist direction. Question 2 is the South, representing sustainability. What is the immediate harm we must reduce right now? If we ignore this, people suffer in the real world.
The immediate harm is bankruptcy. If we go under, 200 people lose their jobs, lose their health care, and our clean tech never makes it to the market at all.
So we have established the tension. The string is pulled tight. Now, question 3. The West, representing adaptability. What is the smallest conscious compromise that actually moves us forward? Not surrender, not pure perfection, but pragmatic movement.
This is the hard part. We don't buy the toxic materials because that violates the North Star. But maybe we compromise the timeline.
Okay.
We delay the launch by 2 years. We pivot to a consulting model temporarily to generate cash flow. We do a 15% reduction in force instead of 40%, and the executive team takes a 50% pay cut.
Huh.
It's ugly. It's not the dream. But it keeps the ship afloat without poisoning the cargo.
That is the messy, pragmatic execution. And then comes question 4, the East, representing connection, and this is the linchpin of the whole system. How do you communicate this honestly to the crew?
I have to stand in front of the company and say, we're delaying the dream. We're letting some good people go. It breaks my heart and is a compromise. But we are doing it so that our core technology remains pure and so that the rest of us can survive the storm.
Notice what you didn't do in that communication.
What?
You didn't pretend the layoffs were a victory. You didn't quietly change your company's mission statement to justify the pivot. You named the trade-off out loud. Bannock makes a profound point here. The danger in the captain's dilemma isn't that you choose a side. The danger is forgetting the trade-off.
Forgetting the trade-off.
Yes. When you forget the trade-off, your idealism overextends and becomes dogmatic rigidity. When you forget the trade-off, your pragmatism overextends and becomes moral numbness. The moment your compromise becomes invisible to you, the moment you stop feeling the pain of it, you have lost your integrity.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive talking about an agonizing psychological wound, that tension in your chest that keeps you awake at night when you have to make a hard choice between the purity of your ideals and the muddy reality of the world.
Yeah.
What is the ultimate takeaway for the listener who has to carry that weight tomorrow morning?
The summary of our journey through the Bannock framework is that we must aggressively reject the comfort of the extremes. Idealism detached from pragmatism is wishful cruelty. It demands a perfect world, but leaves real people to bleed while it waits.
And pragmatism detached from idealism is orderly decay.
Exactly. It keeps the trains running on time, but it drives them straight into a moral abyss. The goal of this framework is not to give you a magic formula that eliminates the tension. It is not to help you find a perfectly comfortable middle ground where every decision feels great.
Because that doesn't exist.
It doesn't. As the document powerfully concludes, keep the stars, check the weather, protect the crew, move forward anyway.
Move forward anyway. I want to speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment. What this framework is telling you is that feeling deeply uncomfortable when you make a compromise at your job, in your community, in your marriage, the discomfort does not mean you were doing it wrong.
Not at all.
That tension in your gut is simply the cost of caring simultaneously about both people and principles. It means you are awake. The expert pointed out perfectly. The noticing of the compromise, the lingering sting of it, is what keeps your soul alive. Integrity is not about never compromising. That is a child's view of the world. Integrity is remembering the difference between your absolute direction and your messy decisions and never confusing the two.
It is the unavoidable weight of being a moral agent in a physical world. You will make compromises that feel gross. You will hold ideals that you know you cannot fully realize in your lifetime. But carrying that tension consciously, feeling a pull of the guitar string, is the only way to navigate the storm without losing the ship and without losing yourself.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought to chew on. Something that builds on everything we've discussed today, but pushes it into the reality we are rapidly building for ourselves right now. We have spent this entire hour talking about how incredibly hard it is to carry this tension, how much it hurts to make these choices. But what if the tension itself isn't a problem to be solved? What if the agony of the captain's dilemma is actually a muscle that must be exercised to keep us human?
Expand on that. Where are we losing the muscle?
We live in an age where we are increasingly trying to outsource all of our difficult, messy decisions to algorithms, to artificial intelligence, to hyper-efficient, frictionless systems. We do this precisely because we want to avoid the agonizing pain of compromise.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we want the machine to do the math, so we don't have to feel the guilt. But if we outsource the captain's dilemma to a machine, if we let an algorithm decide who gets the loan, who gets the medical care, who gets laid off, just because the math is pragmatic, are we actually at risk of losing the very tension that makes us human moral agents in the first place? If we stop feeling the pain of the trade-off, do we just become highly optimized managers of our own decline?
That is a chilling and vital question. If we remove the friction, we lose the capacity to feel the tension entirely. And without the tension, the guitar string goes slack, we lose the music of humanity.
We really do. We started today talking about how much we crave the clean, binary certainty of a mathematical equation. But the waters of leadership, of morality, of human progress are never clean. They are a raging storm. And what we've learned today from the Bannock framework is that you don't survive the storm by closing your eyes and pretending the water is clear. You survive it by knowing how to sail in the dark. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep looking at the stars, but keep a very close eye on the weather. We will see you next time.